I'm Angela Martinez, Senior Lecturer in Entrepreneurship at Loughborough University, London, member of the BAME Staff Network, and also the Strategic Architect of the LU Race Equity Strategy. Today, I'm going to be taking you through the race equity guiding principles, which have been developed in order to help people get a baseline understanding of how to approach doing race equity work, especially since we are committed to the action plan of the Race Equality Charter. It's understandable that people don't necessarily have the knowledge that they need to know how to approach addressing this centuries-old problem. So the first thing that we ask is for people to think through whether the actions that they're planning to take are potentially harmful to BAME staff and students. And if it's not possible for an individual to see what the potential harms might be, there are lots of places that you can turn to talk about it before you start doing that thing. So you could approach the BAME Staff Network for a consultation. You can talk to some of our student groups. Right now we have the ACS and the EMN, but we're also soon going to be having a BAME Student Council. And it's really important not to assume that the thing that is going to be done is necessarily going to help, because it could also be harmful. So please check with people if you're not sure, and if there's any question about whether or not somebody might be made perhaps more vulnerable, or somebody's story might be being shared without permission. That's the next principle. There's lots of resources and lots of people that you can turn to get a bit of advice on whether or not this is going to actually help the cause or harm it. One of the issues that we deal with when thinking about racial inequality is underrepresentation, right? So numerically, we often find that BAME, or people of color, as I say, those people are fewer in number as compared to white people, white British people in particular in this context. And so because there are fewer of us, we stand out more. We are seen, the word that we use is hypervisible, and yet sometimes are invisible. So this paradoxical situation means that we run into a particular issue when people want to try to increase representation. The few of us that do exist often have our pictures and our stories shared without our permission. So in order to make the university look more diverse, they might put the pictures of certain students or staff of color on materials without asking whether or not it's okay. And so they become ostensibly or effectively the face of something that they didn't really agree to be the face of. So this is the first kind of example of one way in which harm can be done without, with the intention of wanting to do something positive, which is increase representation. So one of the fundamental things about racial inequality, especially as it shows up in the Western world or the global North, is that in many cases, if we're talking about institutions like universities, staff and students of color are often the only ones who look like them in their particular setting. And when that happens, we can experience things like isolation, alienation. We can feel like we're being othered. There are aggressions that happen, whether they're microaggressions or macroaggressions, and that can be really damaging. So in order to address that, one of the things that we need are safer spaces in which we can gather with people who might have some shared experiences, in which we can safely assume that we're not going to have to deal with things that we deal with in our everyday experiences. So those safer spaces are really vital, and they're not racist because we're not messing with a power structure. We're not saying you're not allowed because we don't like you. We're saying we need space for ourselves in order to be able to share our experiences with each other and support each other. And it should be again something that's really simple, and it shouldn't be a hard ask. So very often when we're trying to make points or make a case for something that needs changing, that would help get us closer to hopefully closer to a state of equality in terms of race and racism, we hear that one white person has spoken to one other person of color, and that person of color has told them that this is not the case, or that they shouldn't believe this because this doesn't happen. And that can be really damaging, because what we're doing in this case is something like tokenism, where we're using one individual voice to deny the lived experience or the collective truth of an entire group of people. So we ask that if you are confronted with a situation in which one single person of color has told you something that contradicts what is being asked for by the collective, such as the entire BAME Staff Network or the BAME Student Council, that we prioritize the collective opinion over the solo opinion of somebody who may or may not be coming from the same angle as the informed opinion of the group. Point 5 is really about making space for BAME staff and students to become leaders within the institution. One of the key findings of REC is that the leadership of the university is predominantly white, is predominantly male. These are things that we are really familiar with. We don't have to necessarily debate, because it's pretty obvious, but it's going to take time in order for those formations to be to evolve. So what we're asking here, and what we're hoping to achieve, is that new leadership structures can be created, and that new pathways to leadership from diverse individuals can be opened up, while at the same time making sure that the leadership of the institution is as stable as it needs to be. And this can happen through a variety of different ways. We can open up seats at tables, which has been done in the past couple of years with the co-optation of BAME staff onto certain committees. And it can happen in more bottom-up ways, like the formation of the BAME Student Council, which is something that's launching this year. We can create mechanisms for BAME leadership in a way that actually adds to and enhances our current leadership processes and structures. So one of the pitfalls that we see often is that BAME staff and students are tasked with creating environments that are safer for themselves, because if they don't do those things, then the environments can be quite difficult to bear. So they do the work to create a greater sense of safety for themselves, greater conditions of equity for their colleagues and for students who look like them, and yet those contributions are very often swept up into the processes of the institution, such that they are not acknowledged for all of the labor that they've done. So, for example, the creation of these principles, we made it very clear at the bottom of all the text that these were created by the BAME Staff Network. If we hadn't done that, it likely would have looked like the principles were created by the institution itself, and that's just not the case. So we need to get into the habit and the practice of making sure that recognition goes where it is due. And if staff and students of color are creating things, are developing things, they need to be recognized for that, whether that's in just acknowledgement, whether that's in the creation of a leadership position, like in principle number 5, or whether that's in some other way that is meaningful and that demonstrates how this leadership is actually taking place, without it being erased or swallowed up by just the typical processes of the institution. So the process of undoing racism is a long journey. It's a lifelong journey. What we're challenging here are actually centuries of a mindset that has been implanted into the various ways in which we run the world. The system of white supremacy is a very, very old system that evolved with colonialism. And it taught us that there's a hierarchy of races in which white people are on top and black people are on the bottom, and there's a full strata of racialized people in between. And even saying it like this shows how silly it really is. We understand, I think, fundamentally these days that this is not the case, but that conditioning is a part of so much that we do. And it's a part of the ways in which we make decisions and the assumptions that we make about each other. And what this principle is trying to get at is that in order to address this grand issue, it's incumbent on all of us to think about how this system has shaped the way in which we work, shaped the way in which we think, shaped the way in which we move through the world, the assumptions that we make about other people. What this principle is not asking us to do is to get really self-conscious or to get really paranoid about the language that we're using. It's actually asking us to think about how history influences the present and how we can make choices in our everyday lives to view more clearly how that past is appearing in our current day-to-day practices. And I really believe that this is actually a kind of an adventure of learning that people can embark on that really opens up a new way of looking at the world. I find it very compelling. I find it very exciting to want to create a world in which there is more equality between people of different backgrounds. And one of the ways that we can get there is by understanding our history. Intersectionality shows up in lots of different ways. It may mean that people have experiences that are more complex than we're assuming. It may also mean that we're forgetting about people at particular neglected points of intersection. And so it's become kind of a blanket term to talk about the diversity within a group. But what it really means is we need to make sure that we're paying attention to other possible dimensions of either oppression or privilege that people could be experiencing. And that it's not necessarily limited to just race or just gender or just class, for example. One of the ways in which we confront institutional racism is the assumption that there are white people and there are BAME people and that they're necessarily going to be the same in each group. And that's just not the case. So BAME is a catch-all term. It's a contested term. Some people really dislike it. Some people are for it. And we can understand why, because it groups a huge number of people with a very diverse set of experiences into a group that makes them look like they're all alike. So that's the homogenizing part. When we talk about BAME people, or as I say, people of color, what we are trying to point out is the differences that they will have from typical experiences of white people, and in this case, mostly white British people. And there is likely to be a differentiation there. But what is not being said is that that group of BAME people are all experiencing exactly the same thing. So it's a catch-all and contested term, it's imperfect, but what we're trying to get at is the differences in their experiences from the experiences of most white British people. This final point that I want to make is that somehow we've gotten to a point in society where because people can get behind the notions of equality, diversity, and inclusion, it seems to be assumed that it's easy to do that work, that it's easy to get us closer to those things that because we all want it, because it's desirable, that we all know how to do it. And that's simply not the case. It is challenging to learn how to undo structural oppressions. They are the water in which we swim. They are the air in which we breathe. And to notice them, first of all, and then to try to take steps towards unpicking them and putting in new ways of working, that's all very difficult work. And so with this principle, what we're asking is that people don't assume that simply because they don't want to be racist or they don't think that they're racist, that they know what to do to undo racism. What we're asking for is the willingness to recognize expertise in this area and to take a steer from people who have been doing the work for a long time. People who really understand how structural racism shows up, how intersectionality makes a difference, right? And why things like safer spaces are important, and to listen and to be willing to learn.